for joining the May 15th, 2018 VOLTA call. And we do have a presentation this morning from AT&T on alarms and PM support. And just a reminder to everyone that we do record these sessions so that we can post it later to the VOLTA playlist. So keep that in mind during the discussion and the presentation. With that, then Tom, I will give you presentation rights if you're ready.
Yes, just a moment. All right. Do you see the presentation now? I'm just checking because I don't know what screen I'm.
I see a global go-to meeting.
Oh, okay.
Page.
All right. So you'll see it soon then. Okay. You should see it now.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. So as introduced, we're going to discuss alarms, events, and performance monitoring and discussion of proposed VOLTA 2.0 user stories. There's some information and user stories already for this in VOLTA, but this is also to bring those to where I think we need to go for 2.0. My computer may be a little slow, it seems, today. But it should be on the next slide now.
Yeah, in page 2.
You see that? Yes. Okay. So this is a context diagram for focusing on particular scope here. We're particularly going to focus on what a reference VOLT is with Ethernet port uplinks, optical transceivers on them, the internal layer 2 Ethernet switch, the XPON ports, the optical transceivers on them. The XPON ports are essentially could be on board, in silicon, or they could be in the plug, but functionally they're doing the same thing. And optical interface on those as well. And then on the ONT side, reversing that optical PON and Ethernet layer. So this is just the VOLT monitoring context, including Ethernet uplinks. There's some question in my mind. I'm not sure if that's, what adapter would be separating particular things in the implementation. I think we'll get more discussion on that from an architecture point of view. But if there's any issue with this context, I'm interested to hear on this slide. Okay. We'll talk more about details of this on their slides for this information.
Will the slides be made available?
I'm sorry?
Will the slides be made available to everyone later?
Slides.
Oh, yes. Yes, after the meeting.
Okay, great.
I prefer to, if we have to tweak something that's, we missed, it's easy to make an update on, I'll send out afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll just save me some note taking.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I was editing up until the meeting, so my circumstances. All right, the next slide. I wanted to discuss some out of scope, at least for the user stories that we're doing here. Doesn't.
Did Tom just drop off?
Yeah, I think we lost him. Yeah, caller 5, we lost him.
Is he aware? Do you have his cell phone?
Sure. Let me send him a note.
I don't have his cell phone. Okay, I'm texting.
Yeah, so actually he said his phone is still connected, but so we just lost it one way apparently. Yeah, so he's going to...
Redial?
Yes. All right.
Hello. You hear me now?
Hi, Tom. Yes, we can hear you again. Thank
you. Okay. Must have dropped me. It's being unknown or something like that. I don't know. So in this slide, remember there was a recent session about managing other devices and ports in the pod outside of VOLT, addressed by Mike Kasser. I think there's some different modeling that's going to be dependent upon what those other devices are doing, kind of health we want to monitor in them. They were really in a pod management scope and not a VOLTA scope. I'm proposing, I'm saying here that be addressed by service provider integration. That's at least until we get some common definition, possibly of the pod management. So I'm willing to discuss this and make adjustments as needed if we think we have a direction on pod management, want to be more specific, we could do that probably in as a follow-up. Now, within the pod, we're really not managing VNFs the way it was defined, and actually VNF monitoring is something that would be generally addressed in the cloud service providers context, what cloud they're using, what VNF requirements they have, and how they monitor. So I think that should also be addressed by service provider integration and outside of the scope of VOLTA. The subscription of northbound systems to the Kafka bus for receiving alarms and events to PM and forward them somewhere else, that's out of scope for VOLTA. However, VOLTA should specify interface definitions for the northbound controllers or OSS. We'll talk more about on recommendations. I think it's on the next slide. Let's see. So some discussion I think is relevant towards some of the JIRAs that I've seen are very relevant for OMCI, collecting alarms and events and PM from ONU, and I think there's some placeholders to talk about how those should be how those will be handled in VOLTA 2.0. I'm not sure we've discussed that yet. The general suggestion, because I've seen essentially alarms and PM related to the adapter functions, existing adapter functions such as the Broadcom and one JIRA written already for an open OLT reporting some alarms. That my thinking is that the OMC function should operate as an input to the adapter going forward, which I think would be the open OLT adapter for reporting alarms, events, and PM to the management interfaces, which would include the Kafka bus, CLI, et cetera. So comments on this slide, questions? Okay. Go to the next slide. So,
hello. I just had a question about the previous slide. This is Sean. So I see that the aggregation switch is not part of, FCAPS doesn't include the aggregation switch, gathering FCAPS for aggregation switch. So does that mean that from an ONAP's perspective, when you look at a PNF, the PNF is just VOLTA and the PNF doesn't include aggregation switches? Because
no,
I've seen I've been seeing some diagrams where.
Putting,
Go ahead.
yeah, the aggregation switch is part of the pod or the PNF. It's a relevant question. I didn't address modeling and reporting on that here. I actually wanted to put it here because, and when I covered this part of this slide, I said this one's a little bit different in that we talked about pod management in another meeting and about managing the pod within a within some northbound management interfaces. To the extent that there are some things that we could augment here. I didn't address them for today, but I'm thinking of things like the switch is going to have some certain, if we're going to go into managing the aggregation switch there. And I'm willing to come back and make the updates on this based upon our agreement here. But the we would want to do some generic modeling of what that would look like and discuss, what things would be monitored, such as common Ethernet performance parameters, common Ethernet alarms. There may be commonality on those things to what's in a VOLT, because the VOLT has those things as well, similar for the other items. But I think it's I'm willing to say, is Mike Gasser on? Mike, I haven't had a chance to talk to you about this. Yeah, so on this particular point here, aligning it with the intent of what you covered for pod management on your presentation the other day, what I'm saying here is that in the VOLTHA context, which is specific to managing what's in VOLTHA, we're saying it's out of scope, but wouldn't be out of scope for managing the pod. And to the extent that we want to go down detailed user stories for the pod, we could add alarms and PM for the elements of the pod, but I'm just not doing it here. If we agree we're going to do that, then I'll change the wording on this and say, it's another we could do some generic modeling. But the thing about it is, where would those the Kafka bus is within VOLTHA. Those other devices aren't really being managed by VOLTHA. So fundamentally, I have trouble thinking what I would propose otherwise here, or whether the management for those devices could be extended to a Kafka bus. But I don't know if it's the Kafka bus that we can use on VOLTHA. So that there's a question here, and it's a valid question. Right now, I'm not answering it the way the slide is not answering the question, but I did want to raise it and specifically talk about pod. So comments on what do we think we should do as far as fully addressing it, where we would put alarms and PM in the pod, what management path we would go through. I'm interested to hear ideas here.
No, I just asked the question because because of the previous meeting where we defined a pod, but I think this makes sense. It limits the scope and limits, and in the sense it really it's a very clear scope for FCAPS over here. So it was just a question, but I kind of agree with the scope that you defined here.
Yeah, what we could do
I mean, the question that I have is exactly what is that management of the pod if it's not software that's running here. I mean, if we skinny down VOLTHA and VOLTHA is just the VOLTHA components that get installed in the software, I mean, we need to have some management software for the other pieces of the pod, and I'm not quite sure what is the management interface to manage those. I don't know.
What I propose to do here is the slide says VOLTHA context, and I think what we are talking about is VOLTHA context. I think what we need to say is for pod management context, there's something that exists, and there's something that we need to define. We're just not defining it here. We'll take it, as part of the overall FCAPS, and it may get into different priorities in terms of those user stories because of that, but I think we need to cover. So how does that sound, Mike? For purposes
I mean, that's
of this
fine.
presentation. Yeah. Okay, so I'll add and change this to talk about a pod management context. Okay. The specific bullet on monitoring of devices and ports in the pod. All right, thank you for the questions.
Hey, Tom, can you go back to your slide 2? Because I missed part of the discussion and want to see that diagram again. Okay, so just, okay, I'll have a question maybe later. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Kevin. I'll have some comments on this later too. There's something on this slide I'll need to comment. It'd be better to save for the detail later. Okay, so we just covered this slide here, and then we want to. This slide is going to cover what I think is important for northbound management and overall scale testing. So I think we want some JIRA for documenting the interface spec for northbound systems to subscribe to the Kafka bus for specified alarms and events, and also for subscribing to the Kafka bus for specified PM collections. And this is assuming we're using the Kafka bus as the external interface for these things. Scale and performance test plan. So as we scale up to a maximum number of VOLTs, ponds, and ONUs, what's the collection look like, and how do we go about planning for that scale and testing it, whether it's simulation or real testing at some point. Also, based upon what we're trying to collect, the specification should document the capacity of the Kafka bus in terms of days or hours of alarm history and PM collection history. That would be based upon the capacity. There's some storage behind the Kafka bus. There's some retention capability, and then there's some worst case collection that would be driven by number of ONUs, and ONU PMs would be the largest driver there. So the assumption here is that we don't need FluentD for the northbound interface, but it could be useful for formatting alarm and PM history into logs for local management. Now, this would not, I didn't say this way, but this is not to provide a northbound interface. It would be more of an operator interface, someone who was attached directly into VOLTHA, let's say, and just benefited from looking at the logs directly. So like I think, yeah, I did say that. We don't assume they would be needed for providing interfaces to northbound systems. I think this is assuming that the Kafka bus capacity is going to be sufficient and that our interface specifications are well defined as far as what an alarm type is, what a performance monitoring type is. Then I think we can define an external interface off the Kafka bus. It also has the benefit of being a more readily available interface to the external world. All right, I meant to delete this slide because I took care of it on the last one. Okay, alarms and events. There is some prior work in VOLTHA for alarms and events. There was a definition of a universal generic alarm event message type, and then also David Brainbridge has put on VOLTHA discuss a question about should we cover everything inside of VOLTHA? Do we need to configure everything for an alarm? One proposal, and there may be other things that we could propose to move out, but at a minimum, move the alarm severity configuration. I'm going to say configuration here just to be explicit. It's my intent to say that. And this has, I'm supportive of this. I'm interested to hear what others in AT&T think and other service providers think. But I think this just moves something that doesn't need to be in every VOLTA instance. It could be in the management application controller, OSS outside of VOLTA. Less instances would need to be updated to do that. So I think it would be easier. It's a little different. I think we configure it today all the way down through to relatively lower level or at this level. But I think it has merit to, and it's not some major thing to put the requirement outside of VOLTA. But again, that question was raised on VOLTA Discuss. I wanted to highlight it here. I don't know if there's been a lot of discussion of it. I'm supportive of it. I think it would work for AT&T, but that's just one opinion within AT&T, and that's not all the opinions in AT&T, and it's not the opinions of other service providers. So interested to hear that. I think we would want to continue that discussion on that thread actually in VOLTA Discuss. Just want to highlight it here for if we do want to address, we would address with the new JIRA. And then just wanted to note that there's another JIRA that indicates there are alarms being reported to Kafka bus. Just wanted to know if anyone can validate that, and also as we define this, is there anything that we need to do any differently in code, perhaps because we're changing to an open OLT adapter, for example, that we would want to raise another JIRA that essentially that's something asks for the same thing, but for 2.0. Okay, so if there's not an opinion, I'm going to assume yes, and we'll take care of assuming that we would need to do something. But in general, I said open OLT several times. I think we'll want to have a specific discussion around this topic in the open OLT adapter development. So I think that's a key takeaway from this in general for the architecture discussions we'll need. Any comments or questions there? Opinions?
Just a question. I apologize that I was not part of the previous discussions. When we are talking about moving the alarm severity outside of VOLTA, I totally agree with that. I'm also thinking that VOLTA should not define what an alarm is. It should just be an event, and it's the system outside of VOLTA that will define whether that event is an alarm or not.
That's true. I agree. We should call this an alarm event message type, and that's what the JIRA says. An alarm is actually an event with severity, right? And an event could be some events are transient, some are standing. So let me just there's one type. Then the type would be the name. So this would be a name, right? And the alarm is an event mapped to a severity. I'll put that comment here on this. Thank you for noting. I sometimes when we discuss this topic, we gloss over that definition, and it's good to always include it. Okay, so something like that, I'm proposing make that clarification. That way, it's when we move this, if we move this out, then we understand it's actually one entity, alarm or an event, one entity. Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Next slide. So these next few slides are just some summary of some of this information has been passed through the VOLTHA community already, and it's just descriptive. So one point is that we need to check if these are already covered by JIRA tickets and generate to the open VOLT adapter as needed. So we'll do that as part of discussion with the open VOLT adapter form and also the audit against existing JIRAs. And then there is an existing JIRA on retrieving ONU alarms, and it exists for the Broadcom adapter. And again, should we write an easier story for the open VOLT adapter? And the ONU alarms requested in the JIRA that's open are noted as being captured in the POC3 test strategy document. I did summarize them here. So thank you. Someone provide, thank you, Roy. I included those here. And then JIRA, that JIRA ticket notes user stories would be created for each alarm who would still want to take this approach. Some may already exist, but for ECM. I added one additional one here that could possibly be detected an OMCI failure. So if there's any, I put that one in bold at the bottom. It wasn't part of the list. Those came from that POC3. It was referenced from this JIRA. And so these are the Ethernet alarms, events of interest, loss of signal, alarm failure, transmitter failure. There may be some others, but those are key ones. Let's see. So that covers alarms and events. The next section is PM. So before we go to PM, any comments or questions on alarms and events? Okay. So for PM, there are some JIRA for PM already, but and they're primarily just to define retrieving some PM from the system, but not any periodic PM collection. So this section is going to be longer, and I'm going to cover some definitions here. So performance monitoring is to collect read-only measurements. Measurements is a key word, and under measurements, some different types of measurements, including counters, bit error counts, or values, for example, receive optical power. The error counts have a rollover capability as well. Status fields, such as enabled or disabled, are not measurements. So there was a previous session from Mike Gasser on status, and so those have been covered already. So we just are covering measurements here. All measurements that we're going to discuss here can be retrieved on demand for the current value. So it would be a retrieve current PM query response type API. And we would, I think there's a JIRA for examples of that already. We would be more specific about all the collections here that are in this and that we have identified. Oh, Shad, thank you for the JIRA for open VOLT alarms. That was one of the examples I did see for that we already have some noted. So thanks for showing it to everyone. Okay, yeah, I don't know if that went to everyone or just to me, but JIRA 773 already covers an example of some open VOLT alarms. There's already open VOLT.
It will cover the loss of signal and the dying gasp. I would say, of course, I think the loss of signal probably has higher priority. If you can implement both at the same time, that'd be great. But if you cannot, maybe loss of signal will be the first.
Oh yes. So back on the alarms, when we do, I think what we'll want to do is add on the other alarms that we know about. And the good thing is Shad has indicated OpenOLT as the direction for alarms by submitting that. Sure. Now back to PM. Some measurements are available for periodic collection. So in this presentation, if we're saying they're required for periodic, we will specify the interval type on the slide next to the description for the PM count. Also, we'll assume. Yeah.
So Tom, I provided that the LS our collection from the broadband tool to the community at one point. I don't know what it's still on the file list. Are those lists up to date?
Yes. So I referenced those when I made these updates, and then I made some additional. There are some potential other PM collections that may be in that list. I'm not going to say they're any higher. They're not going to be at the high priority. I think that list was very good at identifying a priority, and I pretty much ported all that into some of the slides below, and we'll go through those fairly quickly because I'm going to say they're based upon that list, that prior list, and then I'll note where we say there may be something else that could be done. I mean, we might write some future JIRAs, but we're not pointing out anything today that it's going to be a high priority other than what's already on that list. Is that fair?
Thanks.
And yeah, thank you. Yeah, the list really helped. And we put it into just a different classification here so that it can follow it out of this presentation. So one thing is some PM systems allow you to have a measurement interval that might be there might be multiple measurement intervals, but a longer collection interval. Let's say if you were measuring it every 15 minutes, but you wanted to collect it every hour, you could have 4 measurements and 1 collection interval of an hour. We're going to assume here that the measurement interval is the same as the collection interval. I don't see a reason to change that. It's not something I've seen in an OLT before, unless there's just some good reason why we want to do it differently. I suppose that we define it the same. Now this is new because I don't think we have periodic PM going to the Kafka bus yet, and since the alarms are going to be done in the OpenOLT adapter, proposing here that the OpenOLT adapter as well does the push performance monitoring. Now, there's some things about performance monitoring because they're periodic collections. They have to be done each measurement interval, and all the systems need to process all the data from that management interval for everything to scale. That includes to the northbound out of VOLTHA, but definitely through VOLTHA is what we care about. Now, one thing is that some measurement intervals can be done, can be possibly triggered in the hardware, and the hardware may trigger it, create a collection, create, let's say, a 15-minute interval register, maybe what's called the last 15-minute interval register. And I'm not talking about any, I don't even know whether for sure, what, and of course the Ethernet switch may be collecting Ethernet PM, and there may be a different, capability on the PON chip, for example. So these have to be considered. So the hardware may not have a timer to trigger the interval. In that case, the OpenOLT adapter will need to trigger collections at the measurement interval, such as by using an NTP server to trigger it. And this may have certain implications on, there might be a little bit of a lag on, and not maybe quite as precision of hitting the 15-minute intervals as closely, but I think if the I think it can be addressed. And given local compute, the triggers to go query should be some optimization there. But we need to keep it in mind in terms of how this would perform.
Okay, Tom, on something like this, I think you hit a really good point where the software may be doing the periodic checking. It may be you push a requirement into the response data or something like that, where you may trigger the collection at 15 minutes, but then you either have some other parameter that's recorded that indicates the delay in reporting, right? So that you get, oh, it was 15 minutes and 30 seconds or whatever, right? You have some other parameter that helps you figure out what the variation is off the 15 minutes.
Yeah, we want the start-stop is really what we want. So there's a slide that's a lead into, maybe on the next slide, we address the start-stop. Now, there are no other questions. I'll go to that next slide and cover the rest of that question.
Are there any requirements around, let's say the physical OLT it loses connectivity to the the adapter in the compute? Is there any requirement around how long the OLT needs to collect 15-minute intervals while not connected to the system until he has a chance to push those up or have them collected?
That's a good question. So if the hardware provides some registers for intervals that haven't been collected yet, then that would be limited by the registers or enabled by the registers that may cover a 15-minute interval or more, let's say. And then if the hardware doesn't have any registers, then the collection, because it would be triggered from VOLTHA, you'd have a long collection interval. You'd have one possibly that's beyond the 15 minutes. And the management interface may want to throw out that as a bad interval because it's going to have if it has a large variation from 15 minutes. So in the industry, that's one approach. That's not necessarily the only approach. Your PM application does a full divide by, it doesn't care that it varies a lot from 15 minutes. It could take that approach too. But good question. There's probably let's see, we've had 2 questions on this, and I didn't cover the exception cases here, so I'm going to make a note. Slide 11. What happens for exceptions? And so one is the varied 15-minute interval, and one is more of an extended unavailability of communication.
Also, the open OMCI will probably be a collector, I guess, with the ONU-based PM intervals. Does that make more? I think that would make more sense.
Does that provide some history of? So the question is, the hardware that's collecting from the PON would still need to have some retention, although if we can't talk to the compute, we may also not be talking to the open OMCI adapters, but maybe one process is up and one is down too as well. So let's make a note of that. I open OMCI provide any backup to VOLTHA. We'll want to discuss that because that's really the question I have, whether it provides any retention or availability to help there.
Yeah, I guess the hardware typically is, or the standard is, you get a current and previous 15-minute bin down at the ONU, and you need to collect those. You you need to get around every 15 minutes to go collect those. Otherwise, you'll lose data. Yeah.
Yeah, we would be in the same situation if we completely had management loss here. It would be the same scenario. I don't think we'd be sacrificing anything. We would just be performing the same existing solutions. But I'm interested to hear if that's if you agree.
I would be concerned in anything that we say here that we don't push undue requirements on the hardware itself, right? So I know most systems today can easily support the 15-minute interval, the periodic interval collection on box. But as we push less and less onto the hardware and move more and more into the software, I think that hardware will be less and less capable of having the ability to maintain those statistics over time, right? So maybe the device can manage a 15-minute interval of statistics, but it may not have the memory locally to keep that for 24 hours, that kind of thing. So I think we need in our thinking around the architecture, just don't push on the hardware requirements that that may not be capable in the type of virtualized environments we're talking about.
Understood. In part, based upon that understanding, I wrote what I did at the bottom of the slide. I'm pretty much, I don't think this is saying that we expect the hardware to have it. Although, from an impact statement point of view, can we address that way? So one thing is, in general, from an open OLT perspective, we're going to want to, I think, describe a common behavior based upon a common interface. But I think for something like this, we will need to note if the adapter is triggering the interval collection and what happens with interval collections here. And I think when we get into the sections below on what's actually going to be the type of collections here, we get into considering probably, and I would like to say each hardware we should be aware of it for what the design is, which we're trying to do here, and for this limitation, but also to leave the I think perhaps I'm trying to say this a certain way, but leave the specific hardware behavior differences as some exception notes that are not necessarily covered. But in this particular case, we're noting that we're already going to have a timer in the open LT adapter if for this case. So, but the app notes on measurement intervals, I think we're going to have some areas to discuss here when we actually get into those details. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah.
What's the lowest sampling interval that we would allow? Would it only stay at 15 minutes, or can it be reduced down, let's say, seconds or microseconds? Does it make sense?
We don't. I don't think we want to do any seconds or microseconds. It would unless you're doing it on one point. Think of the 15 minutes as a workload, and think of the number of collection points in that time frame as part of the workload. And the workload includes being able to do all the sampling, pull it, move it through all the management interfaces, get it on the Kafka bus. We want to be well within the 15 minutes or whatever our measurement interval is to do all of that. And we're going to have, you'll see some things that scale at the ONU level here, where we'll be collecting from every ONU every 15 minutes. And that could get into a few thousand ONUs, depending upon your OLT size, just one OLT. So There's one particular thing that has been we've seen also done at 5 minutes versus 15 minutes, but that would be for purposes of granularity of the service provider. They may want to have that. What we're trying to do here is just provide some standard type of, and not go too far and too aggressive on to drive scale here.
And I want to do a time check here because I believe there's another meeting using this bridge at the top of the hour, so we have to drop off a couple minutes before. And I'll need a couple minutes at least to do a quick recap of Sprint 1 since it closes this week. So Tom, you have maybe about 4 to 5 minutes left.
Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay. Just like a common alarm type, we would need a common performance monitoring record type. And I don't think I've covered everything here, but these are key things. Date and time of the collection, the measurement interval boundaries. This is the start-stop we're talking about. So if the start-stop varied off of, let's say, that 15 minutes, we could derive what the actual interval measurement is from the start and the stop. The element name, which would be the device, the collection point name, which could be like the port name, the period measurement, and the collected data from a key and value perspective. And I think there's some more design here behind this to cover everything what we'll want and need per an external interface in OSS. So I'm interested in completing this and getting input on it. And we can do that outside the meeting. We'll be sending this out to Volt to discuss to get that input. Okay, if there's no questions there, optical measurements, I'm not going to read through it all, just to say these, back to what Sean mentioned before, there are some periodic here, and but not all are periodic. They're requested for periodic. That way, there's a couple key pieces of data we get every 15 minutes from an ONT. It's transmit power and receive power. This is just to make sure that the light is still working the way we want and not degrading. And this is where you get to some scale on ONTs. These priorities are 1 is highest and 2, and these were consistent with what was in the reference that Sean mentioned before. Okay. PON, also called channel pair and XGS measurements for OLT and ONT. There's measurements for utilization of the PON and for error count. So this is where we get into a counter, and that's based upon a time. So where we're counting across the time, not just a level like a power. This is where we would think about whether we care about some variation of 15 minutes. But if we do the start-stop correctly, we can actually get a rate for the utilization, no matter what, if we vary off at 15 minutes. So I think we're okay there. If the hardware is being pulled and with some variation of 15 minutes. We still include multicast in here. That was in the previous list, and the priorities are the same. That was in the list that Sean had provided last year. And channel receive bit errors. This particular one added bit 32, bit 8 words were not previously specified. If we have that information, it would provide more information about a rate of error. So if you have whether the bit errors are small or large relatively to bit 8 words is what you'd be looking at that. So that is something new, Sean, that particular one. And then there are other possible measurements that could be useful for on-demand troubleshooting. For example, forward error correction counts. We're not proposing they're part of periodic collection, but they may be interesting for troubleshooting. So, and if there are capabilities that are fairly common in the hardware, would drive more of an interest to write some user stories, but nothing at this time.
Are these collected per ONU as well, or this is just per channel pair?
Good question. If they were, they could possibly be on ONUs as well. So let me say and/or ONT to address your comment. Fair enough. Okay.
Yep.
So I think we're really close to the end here. ONU performance monitoring. There's a JIRA for this. We will just address it with respect to POC3 test strategy, user stories for each stat, and I would say we already covered those in the slides above. Optical measurements and utilization are what's relevant for ONT or ONU PMs. We don't do any. Okay. Did I cover something here? You know what? I missed a slide, and I don't know what to do with it, but I'll tell you what it is in a minute. There is a PM collection configuration we may need to reissue for integration with OpenLLT adapter. I missed the slide on Ethernet PMs. Those are basically your typical IF MIB stats. This is one of the easier things to spec, so I didn't do it yet. I meant to put it in here. But I also didn't mention layer 2. There could be interest in getting layer 2 information for troubleshooting, possibly on demand at first, just to check is traffic flowing using the Ethernet switch data to do that for troubleshooting. Adding it to periodic collection drives up, scale, so it's not something we typically do. I left that. I missed those two things, so I need to put in the layer 1, layer 2 Ethernet, and what I just said about those, in that context.
Is that per subscriber union affairs collection or for?
Yes, actually. Yeah, good question. So you could actually monitor per subscriber in the switch, and you could also monitor the VLAN adaptation layer. Could also monitor it on the ONT. And for simple ONTs that have one Ethernet adapter, you only need to monitor at one point. If you had a business ONT, you could possibly monitoring your client ports as well. So it could be a third point there. So per subscriber in the switch, per ONT Ethernet layer, and then per ONT client port could be monitored. You don't need per ONT client port for simple ONT, single subscriber ONT. But does that make sense? I'll add something. This is a quick add to add this to the slides. And that's it, Julie.
Great, thank you. Any quick questions for Tom? They have to be really quick because we need at least a minute to talk about Sprint 1. Any quick questions for Tom? Okay, thank you everyone for the discussion. Tom, I'm going to take presentation rights back.
Okay.
Hopefully, here we go. Okay. All right, so we've got about 2.5 minutes. Hopefully, can you see the screen with the draft that was from the agenda? Is that visible? Great, okay, thank you, Sean Ying. So quickly, we don't have time to go into updates on any of the individual tickets, so let me just quickly ask the technical leads that are working and leading the efforts going on in Sprint 1, do you have any issues that need to be brought up with the community today? Because we have Sprint 1 wrapping up on Friday.
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not hearing anything there. So I apologize, we don't have time to go over them. I do know also there are a number of new issues that were entered for Sprint 1 by Ken for some additional work. So everyone please take a look so you can see what is getting added to the scope for Sprint 1. And a reminder, Sprint 1 is closing on Friday, and so we do need to have some planning for Sprint 2 as well. I think at this point, I'm going to say Thursday this week, we have to deal with Sprint work, and we'll have to postpone any other presentations to future weeks. because we need to have some time to do some planning for the next sprint. The next item I wanted to talk about with the community, so it's in the agenda. So we do have the user stories related to the Redfish code used for device management for the EdgeCore OLT. And right now we've been carrying it over from sprint to sprint, and still we do not have anyone who is an owner at this time for the development, maintenance, and testing of that code. Is there anyone in the community who is willing to take that on? Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so I'm going to take that as a no for now. So what I'm going to propose we do is move the JIRAs to the backlog, and I will unassign them from current assignees, and then we will put them in the backlog. And if there are service providers or others who believe that these need to be prioritized, then we need to find an owner so we can bring them into a later sprint in 2.0. But right now, I can't keep them in sprint 1 with no one assigned to kind of lead that work. So any objections to me moving those items to the backlog? Okay, and then Shad, I saw you did have a comment on this on VOLTHA Discuss. Let's see if we can continue additional feedback if we need it for VOL 248.